The panelists are, we were supposed to have the National Security Secretary of Armenia, Armen Grigoryan, but apparently his schedule is very busy and he couldn't make it today. But we have with us Judge Gasya Abkaryan, the international lawyer Karnik Kirkonian, and the historian Vahakan Avedyan. The moderator today will be Professor Nerses Kopalyan. Professor Kopalyan is an assistant professor in residence in political science at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He specializes in international relations, geopolitics, political theory, philosophy of science. He has conducted extensive research in polarity, superpower relations, and security studies. He's the author of The World Political Systems After Polarity and the co-author of Sex, Power, and Politics. He also authored 2 policy papers for the Republic of Armenia, and the Transitional Justice Agenda for the Republic of Armenia, and also Changing the Paradigm in Armenia Diaspora Relations. He serves as an advisor to the Office of High Commissioner of Diaspora Affairs, Mr. Sinanyan. His current research concentrates on geopolitical and great power relations with an emphasis on Eurasia. He has also done extensive work on political developments in Armenia prior to and subsequent to the Velvet Revolution, articles of which are published in EVN Report. He's also constantly traveling to Armenia and advising the government on various issues. Nerses, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jakob. Thank you for that introduction. And I want to thank ARPA for introducing me and hosting this very important talk. And I also want to thank all the panelists. We have a rather prestigious panel today that is joining us. So today's discussions are going to revolve around the whole notion of how international law and international instruments may be utilized to enhance Armenia's security architecture. So the relationship between our international legal capacities, capabilities, and the enhancement of Armenia's security situation has become a very, very important and entrenched development. I have done some work within the scope on Armenia's security architecture, and since the September wide-scale incursion attack that we saw from Azerbaijan, a lot has changed. And one of the more important conversations that we have been having is how are we going to redevelop Armenia's security architecture? And some of the conversation has revolved around a concept that I've called the diplomatization of security. And an important component of this is utilizing both diplomatic tools and international legal tools. And we do have panelists here that have been involved in this process, who have played an instrumental role in enhancing Armenia's security through the utilization of international legal instruments. So an important component of our discussion is going to revolve around those precepts. I do want to begin our first discussion with Judge Gasya Abkaryan. She has extensive experience on developing the sort of the processes, the technical know-how, the training of lawyers, with the monumental work that her and her organization, the Center for Truth and Justice, have done in developing cases or helping develop cases that have been very, very important for Armenia with respect to the use of international instruments. So Gasya, the floor is yours. Please proceed with your presentation, and then we'll move on to our other panelists.
Thank you, ARPA. Thank you, Nerses. Thank you for inviting me, and hello to my colleagues here today. So the part that I think I'd like to talk about is we all want Armenia's national security to be strengthened. Clearly, Artsakh is definitely one of the weak points that we have. How do we do this? Where do we go to do this? And the part that I've been involved in and truly believe is an extremely strong political tool that won for 30 years since Armenia's independence has really not been developed nor used is the international legal mechanisms. Prior to independence, obviously, Armenia did not have sovereignty in order to execute anything of the type under Soviet rule. However, since independence, Armenia has absolutely due to so many reasons that we don't need to discuss now, has not used the international legal mechanisms in order to bring forth understanding, education, development, and therefore change as it relates to Armenia and Artsakh. Unfortunately, the 44-day war, at least in my case and with the group of lawyers that I work with, was a huge wake-up call. And what it did was it made us reflect on what have we done, though we're all survivors of the Armenian genocide. We're all descendants of survivors. And what did we do for 100+ years other than demand justice? Did we use any legal mechanisms to bring anybody to justice? And in order to do that, you have to do the foundational work. And the foundational work is, before I move to that, I want to just reflect on the fact that during the 44-day war, I kept watching Armenians in Artsakh and in Armenia say, the world has forgotten us. Why isn't the world doing anything? Well, the world's not going to do anything for you unless you do something for yourself. We have this need that the UN needs to send a delegation, the Swiss need to come, the French, the Americans. Yeah, they're not going to come and collect your evidence. They're not going to collect forensic evidence. They're not going to collect testimonial evidence of the atrocities and the war crimes. This is for us to do. It is our responsibility, and this is how we create our own agency. Instead of continuing to become the victim nation state, we are to become the nation state that's going to take things into its hands. And so the agency I'm talking about is, when the day comes, when the right time comes, we need evidence that is going to be admissible in courtrooms, whether they are international courts or local jurisdictions. And we've already seen the evidence of this. The first one is the most important one at this point is the case in the International Court of Justice, Armenia versus Azerbaijan. And evidence that we've been collecting, firsthand testimonial evidence, has been used and is continuing to be used, because at the end of the day, Nexus, what needs to happen is victims need to have a place where their truth is heard. And if their truth is going to be heard, their truth needs to be preserved. And if their truth is going to be preserved, it needs to be handed over to those who are going to use it. So the toolbox that we have to fundamentally change the national security of Armenia must include international legal mechanisms. And that's where my team comes in, that's where I come in. And there's no such thing as it's purely legal. Everything legal is also ultimately political. Everything humanitarian is also ultimately political. There is no such thing as anything being purely political. But this is a tool and an agency that Armenia has now in its hands. And I see Armenia getting stronger in that way, but we are one nation. Armenia, or the government, cannot do this alone. The number one asset Armenia has is the diaspora, and the diaspora has more lawyers than you can count. And lawyers understand the system of making evidence admissible. Armenians in Armenia do not, because they don't have that system. So that's where we come in. We teach young lawyers and young law students how to collect testimonial evidence of war crimes and make it admissible, and ultimately turn it over, as we already have done and continue to do, to those that are litigating and getting ready to litigate. So that's the tool that I focus on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kostya. I do have a set of questions that we'll be posing later on. Specifically, I think there's been a lot of fascination on the relationship between war crimes or the amount of war crimes that we've seen and how that will be utilized to produce some kind of outcomes. So we'll kind of address that a little later after the other presenters, but the very, very important thing proceed with. Next on the panel will be Karnik Krikorian. Karnik has done excellent work on developing international legal theories, specifically to Armenia's conception of sovereignty and how this could be utilized as an instrument in enhancing both Armenia's national security and its sovereignty, which are intertwined. I had the privilege of engaging with Karnik about a week ago in Armenia, the Global Armenia Summit. We discussed these concepts extensively. So the floor is yours, Karnik. Please proceed.
There we go. Thank you, Nesses, and thank you, Atba, for this opportunity to speak. And really, what is unquestionably one of the most difficult and dire moments of our recent history. I mean, we are facing existential threat. We're in moments of torment and trauma, of injustice and indignity. And it's interesting how this moment delivers us back to a collective memory of unresolved injustice, which is, I think, something Professor Avedian will be speaking about shortly. And at the same time, pushes us forward into a sea of somewhat ominous uncertainty. We're at this ledge where sovereignty, security, and even our dignity as a nation are quite frankly teetering. And so while we endure these experiences of state creation, of war, of sovereignty, of statehood, victory, defeat, self-determination, and human rights abuses, I think it's really important to step back and realize that those very concepts, those legal theories and concepts are in a state of monumental flux right now. And these legal concepts are at the core of some of the most fundamental challenges facing the Armenian nation today, and they're being molded as we speak. I'm sure we'll get into the concepts of sovereignty, how it's relevant and why it's important today, but I want to focus really on the concept of self-determination now, because as I read the abstract, I realized that there's some fundamental theoretical underpinnings, which I think we really have to start to appreciate and actually incorporate into our discourse. And I want to focus just in these 5 minutes on three major points. And one is this juxtaposition of territorial integrity versus self-determination. The other is the idea of internal self-determination versus external self-determination. And then the last point, which Judge Avkarian's work is really relevant to, is the ability to really understand this in factual and also historical context. So I want to kind of just briefly touch on those points, and I'm sure we can get into a lot of the things more substantively in question and answer. One of the main things that we see now is this, we believe to be this juxtaposition between territorial integrity and self-determination. That somehow these are competing concepts, and because they're competing concepts, the battle that we have to wage is the one against territorial integrity, or in some cases, we have to defend that principle when it comes to the borders of Armenia. And we have to defend the principle of self-determination when it comes to the issues that we face in Artsakh. I want to kind of debunk this myth right at the beginning, because territorial integrity, importantly, at international law, is a fundamental premise between nation states. It's between states that are recognized by one another. In other words, France has an obligation to respect the territorial integrity of Germany. Argentina has an obligation to respect the territorial integrity of Uruguay. And that's because they are part of the UN Charter, and that's because they have agreed to do so. Last time I checked, the people of Artsakh are not part of the UN Charter. They're not a recognized state. And therefore, this idea of the idea to respect territorial integrity doesn't obviate the need to respect the principle of self-determination. And what's really important is that the principle of self-determination, in a lot of respects, is a more fundamental right. It existed during the philosophical underpinnings existed during the American and French revolutions. It existed through decolonization. We have obviously the case in Kosovo that deals with this principle. Self-determination is where sovereignty comes from. You can't have sovereignty without the idea of self-determination. States don't automatically have sovereignty. Self-determination is a fundamental right that allows peoples to make determinations as to their will. the idea of territorial integrity is an understanding between states. This fundamental dichotomy here is really important to understand, because when it comes to the right of the people of Artsakh to exercise self-determination, the concept of territorial integrity dies off. And let me explain why. It can't be that the principle of territorial integrity means that territorial integrity no matter what. Nobody would tolerate a state executing its citizens en masse and say that, well, the principle of territorial integrity means that we shouldn't get involved or we shouldn't be interested in what's happening inside that state. We're long beyond that period under international law. We've moved on to a period where the concept of self-determination is relevant based on the experiences of the individuals living within a particular political system. And that brings me to my second point, is this idea of internal versus external self-determination. What does self-determination mean? And I'm taking it out of kind of legal language here and making it as simple as possible. The concept of self-determination really has two major avenues. You have the concept of internal self-determination, meaning that the people's rights to self-determination and their cultural autonomy and linguistic rights and religious rights can be protected within the state. And then you have this other idea of external self-determination, where the only way to actually allow this population to protect itself and its cultural heritage and its rights is going to be for secession. And the best two examples that I've seen to kind of explain this is the issue of Quebec and the issue of Kosovo. In the Quebec example, the Canadian Supreme Court, if those of you who are interested in this topic might remember that in the 90s, there was a movement in Quebec for self-determination, that they wanted to have secession. They wanted to leave Canada and create their own state. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada issued a seminal decision that said that, yes, you have the right to your specific language, you have the right to your specific culture, you have the right to protect those, you have the right to use, and your cultural autonomy should be respected, but you have to do that within the structure of the Canadian federal authority. We have the other example, the other end of this, and that's Kosovo, where the case went to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice said that the Kosovo people's Declaration of Independence is consistent with international law, and that they have a right to secede. Now, what separates the two? And that's really what the question comes down to. What separates the two is something very, very simple, and that is the default is internal self-determination. It's the Quebec model. That's the default. Unless you have something very specific, and that something very specific is the risk of ethnic cleansing or genocide. In other words, if you are at risk of extermination, internal self-determination doesn't make sense. This is the example that one would use if you think about whether or not to put Jews under a Nazi regime. That would not be a result that anybody would accept. That would not be a result that anybody could actually legally justify. And so the real kind of critical element here is to determine whether or not there is a risk, there is an existential risk of extermination, of ethnic cleansing, of genocide. If that factor exists, then internal self-determination is an insufficient remedy for people seeking the right to self-determination. I've overly simplified it, but the point is should be well taken, that the material element that allows for secession, remedial secession, you can give it all the words you want in pure legal terminology, it's called external self-determination. External self-determination exists when internal self-determination creates a situation where the risk of ethnic cleansing and genocide would be pronounced. Clearly, in the Artsakh example, we have that, and that kind of leading to my third point, based in large part in historical context, and really some of the work that Judge Avkarian is doing right now kind of underlies this. In our ICJ case, which Judge Avkarian alluded to, our team is led by Dr. Yelisha Giragosyan. it's really important to kind of understand kind of what the historical context is of that case. The case involved the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which is a convention that was put in as a stopgap measure to prevent genocide. It acknowledged the fact that things like hate speech, cultural erasure, and a number of other kind of actions taken by the state ultimately lead to genocide. So the point of bringing this case under this particular convention is manifold. And one of those is kind of laying out this historical framework that what we're dealing with here is state-sponsored, with respect to Azerbaijan, it's state-sponsored hate, is a state-sponsored policy of elimination of Armenian, not only cultural heritage, but also of Armenian presence. And what comes to mind is one of the bits and pieces of evidence that we presented to the court, and that was the stamp issued, and many of you have probably seen this, by the government of Azerbaijan, where you have a guy in a hazmat suit essentially exterminating the area on the map where Artsakh is located. That's not, these aren't just kind of funny images. These are images that tell a story, and they tell a story in historical context. The state-sponsored beheadings, and I say state-sponsored because we have the situation of Ramil Safarov, where an Armenian was executed, Ramil Safarov executed an Armenian with an axe in Hungary, and then was extradited to Azerbaijan and then celebrated as a hero. These types of state-sponsored impunity contribute to an understanding of what is to come. And I think that's really the important thing, is if we kind of identify, as I explained a second ago, what that critical element is to self-determination, external self-determination, we identify what we need to prove. What we need to show is that anything other than external self-determination will result in ethnic cleansing and genocide. This is something that the authorities, the government in Artsakh has been able to identify and has been able to speak about, which is extremely important. And if we see how the kind of the factual elements that we all witness somewhat traumatically of beheadings, of hate crimes that are really just at a different level. And they're consistently, these aren't one-off events where you have a soldier gone rogue who does this. This is stuff that, when you have an execution of POWs and then is celebrated on social media, that tells you something of the kind of the factual background, the historical background that has led to this. And another point, and I want to kind of just perhaps segue into Mr. Avedian's talk here. When I talk about historical context, it does reach back all the way to the genocide, and we have to contextualize it this way. Nobody can tell our story other than us. We have to be able to tell the story in its full context. And I've had conversations with European politicians who say that, well, there's too much focus on the genocide and the diaspora. And my focus and my response to them is the genocide, in terms of recognition, maybe is really not is not the real focal point here. All the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs, France, Russia, and the United States, have already recognized the genocide. The issue of the genocide is really important because Erdogan made it important when he went to Baku and he spoke of the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide and unfinished business. He actually made the genocide even more relevant than we could have ever imagined. And the issue is to lay it out in historical context, because all of these facts taken together with the actual nature of the hate crimes being perpetrated today will demonstrate the fact that internal self-determination will result in ethnic cleansing and genocide in Artsakh. And that is not an outcome especially any Western power, can agree to. Nobody would, like I said again, nobody would agree to putting Jews under a Nazi regime. And what's interesting here is that in the interim order that was the decision that was ordered by the court in the International Court of Justice, 15 to 0, including, there's a 15 judges to 0, including the judge that was appointed by Azerbaijan, ruled that there needs to be, that Azerbaijan needs to stop its state-sponsored hate speech. In fact, it said hate speech, and it said specifically by state officials. So it shows you what the thrust of the Azerbaijani regime is, and really the factual and the legal parameters are lined up relatively well to make this argument. The issue is being able to actually contextualize it and actually to push this analysis forward consistently, because this is the determining factor in terms of which road we choose, or which road is chosen for us for internal and external self-determination.
Thank you, Karnik. Excellent points. I think when we follow up on a question, I do want to discuss a little more on the given criteria or thresholds that we would need to meet to qualify for external self-determination. I think this is something that needs to be discussed a little more, and we'll touch up on that in a bit. Next panelist is Dr. Vahagan Avetyan. He's done extensive research and work on the politics of memory, the relationship to the Armenian condition, both in post-conflict and post-genocide developments, and how this intertwines with international law. Vahagan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the opportunity to both participate and present my research, and with the risk that I'm going to maybe repeat what the previous speakers have already spoken, because although my major is in history, but I quite early on in my research started to deviate more or less from the historical aspects and became more and more interested in the political science and the international law of it, resulting in my first major peer-reviewed article that I published in the European Journal of International Law on state identity, continuity, and responsibility between the Republic of Turkey and the Ottoman Empire regarding the Armenian genocide, arguing that that is actually one of the pillars of the Turkish denial and the fear of potential legal consequences of Turkish recognition. And that kind of brought me into the area of the aftermath of the Armenian genocide. So actually, when I wrote my PhD thesis, I more or less skipped deliberately the entire genocide episode because I thought that dwelling more on the genocide itself was kind of adhering to the denialist policy or the denialist strategy of having this wild goose chase after the facts and the ultimate evidence that there was a genocide. And I said that there is enough research for that matter, so I'm going to focus on the aftermath of it. So what I did was more or less look at why is the genocide 100 years on still such a great matter whenever it is brought up in foreign parliaments, United Nations, etc. So I looked at the evolution of the discussion of the Armenian genocide in the European Parliament, in the United Nations reports, different reports that actually even came up in the first report emerging in 1948, just before the UN Convention, in which the War Commission uses the Armenian genocide as an example for the Nuremberg Clause and the Tokyo Charter and Nuremberg Charter. And then I continue more or less to 2015, the centennial of the Armenian genocide, in which also then the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is a part of. And my subsequent writing on the matter, which was my PhD thesis and then published by Routledge, was on the politics of the memory of the Armenian genocide, in which I also included the entire Nagorno-Karabakh movement and the subsequent war, but also the notion of the entire movement and why the Karabakh movement can be linked directly, not only to the memory of the Armenian genocide, but also physically, as Mr. Krikorian has now pointed out, that there is actually a physical linkage between those two events, and that we have in the present a very highly scenario that it will end up in an ethnic cleansing, in the best case, if I may call it so. Maybe not genocide in the strict definition of the concept, but definitely an ethnic cleansing of the remaining of Nagorno-Karabakh Artsakh, because we already have an ethnic cleansing of its 1/3 territory after the 2020 war. And my focus right now in my writings, in the op-eds or more or less popular scientific articles that I've published online, is look into the democratic notion or democratic aspects, values of the conflict, looking into, as already mentioned, whether or not the argument that we have two contradicting notions, one territorial integrity on one hand, and one for self-determination on the other hand, which is already mentioned, is not true actually. And I am, one might say quite naively, being an eager defender of the Madrid principles as the only viable peaceful solution to the conflict, in which they actually envisioned merging these two principles together, and which is in fact based on the OSCE Charter from 1975, the Helsinki Final Act, in which the two principles are among 10 principles making out the OSCE Charter, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And number 4 being the respect for territorial integrity, but the number 8, which by the way, none of these 10 are superseding any other, but they are equally equal mutually. But I just want to add to what Mr. Krikorian said, that the 8th principle in regard to self-determination of the people, and I can read it here as a quote, that all peoples have always the right in full freedom to determine when as they wish their internal, and here's the most important question, external political status without external interference. But as I have argued, and as Judge Abkarian has also pointed out, the legal aspects of the international law are more or less saturated with political decisions and political argumentation, which means that even the Helsinki Final Act, even if it is in clear text, means that while it is the states who are more or less safeguarding their territorial integrity, it is the people who have this rightful self-determination. So in the end, it means that it is the states who have the military and economical means to defend their borders, which run over the principle for self-determination of the people. So plainly put, it is the sheer political and economical power which overrides the self-determination of the people. And that is pretty much that I have focused on, and also written articles on the remedial secession as more or less the only solution to the conflict, and argued that, as already mentioned, but I also draw the parallel with, for instance, the ICJ, International Court of Justice, their rationale regarding the secession of the Namibian people of Namibia from South Africa due to the latter's failure to fulfill its obligation to guarantee the well-being and the security of the Namibian people. And here we see, at least in my eyes, and I'm definitely not alone about it, that we have a clear parallel with how the second worst autocratic regime in Europe, ousted only by Belarus, is going to have the suzerainty over the people of Nagorno-Karabakh. And hence the immediate risk of not only failing to fulfill its obligation towards the population of Nagorno-Karabakh, as we see it do in the rest of the Republic of Azerbaijan, but also the imminent risk of total ethnically clean it from its population. And that is more or less what I have been focusing in my research and arguments lately, and I think I will stop there.
Thank you, Vahag. Very important, interesting points that I think we're going to sort of dovetail together and align with the other important and consistent arguments that actually the other panelists were presenting. So I'm gonna jump into the questions here, and this is directed to specific panelists, but other panelists can also add their own assessments, perspectives they so choose. The first question is to kind of a follow up on Kasia's presentation discussion. And, you know, we talk about war crimes, but we haven't really conceptualized it in the lexicon, the narrative, and the modality of thinking as far as what this constitutes and the implications of this. And so I'm very curious, as our viewers, Kasia, what is the relationship between the amount of war crimes and potential outcomes? Meaning, you know, is there a threshold on the scope and magnitude of war crimes that we collect and document, and the anticipated outcomes as to how these could have severe repercussions for Azerbaijan? You know, in the international legal canon, you know, what constitutes systemic war crimes, or if even ad hoc cases are going to suffice. So what is the threshold on the scope and magnitude of war crimes that we're seeing that could actually perhaps produce outcomes that we can instrumentalize to advance our goals?
So it's a fabulous question, and I'm going to backtrack on what Vahagan was saying. The storytelling and the memory that starts with not just with the genocide, but starting with the Hamidian massacres. So, and I'm not saying this because I'm Armenian, and I'm not saying this because I'm trying to defend the rights of Armenians, but from a human rights perspective and from an international law perspective, and I'm sure Garnik can speak about the international law aspect much better than I can. There is this continuum of adopting state policy of annihilation and killing and getting rid of Armenians, even though it's not necessarily being said the way it was said during the genocide, right? I've said this before, and it's a very rough example, but we're just a bump in the road for Turkey and Azerbaijan and the rest of the Turkic world. We're the only democracy in this small area surrounded by autocratic regimes. And, you know, the fact is that their policies, when I say Azerbaijan is implementing the policy that Turkey has verbally stated, you know, finishing what they started over 100 years ago. Now, what does it constitute today? When you do, so we collect testimonial evidence, okay? We don't collect testimony that just says, I was there when I saw them, killing, maiming, mutilating somebody during the war, or my uncle or whatever. The way we collect testimony is we start with the victim's ancestry, okay? So we need to know where your ancestors come from, because one of the factors that makes a difference is this, the tracking of where family comes from and the connection between person and land. The fact that we claim these are our indigenous lands. How do you prove there are indigenous lands? How do you prove that there is a state policy that's a continuum of over 100 years old of state-sponsored atrocities? If you look at numbers, are our numbers so big during the 44-day war? Do we have, mass graves with 10,000, 5,000, 3,000 bodies? No, thank God we don't. And it's not about how many, but if you look at the relationship of how many were killed, massacred, mutilated, tortured, compared to the numbers that we represent, whether it's in Armenia or in Artsakh, it is a huge number. So it's a relationship. But I want to walk away even from that. We're not the only ones that are saying this, so there's this issue of, if Artsakh is allowed within Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan's authority, there will be at a minimum ethnic cleansing, ultimately a genocide. Well, I want to step back. I want to go back to the 44-day war and say what they have done and continue to do with regards to the torture of POWs, the mutilation of bodies. Let me tell you something, there says, some of the bodies that came back from the September 12 or 13 fighting, the 2 days of fighting, we have video and picture evidence of soldiers that died. All right. And then the bodies were returned to them 20, 30 days later, mutilated and beheaded. Okay. So this is akin to this is the preamble to a genocide. Okay. Because it's not just killing in order to advance and land grab. It is killing with hatred and indignation at levels that are inhumane. And I'm going to step away from us Armenians calling this is akin to genocide. The Limkin Institute, which is a non-Armenian organization, the Limkin Foundation or Institute, I think it is. I'm not sure if it's a foundation or institute, sorry. They've come out and said, red flag, this is genocide. And we recently actually met with them, and they are trying to develop this entire platform of what Azerbaijan has done during the 44 days war and subsequently and up to currently with the treatment of Armenian POWs and the slaughters and the killings and the hate language that's coming out of the government of Azerbaijan. There's a continuum of it, of I am here, I am not gone, we will do this, we will complete what we, this rhetoric is equivalent to genocide, is what their platform is. And they're equating it to what happened to the Yezdis, because the Limkin Institute has done a lot of work with regards to the Yezdis, okay, and as well as in Somalia. So this is not an Armenian saying this is a non-Armenian saying it when they're looking at the evidence. And that's, I hate to do this, I hate to come back to it, you still have to provide the evidence to the non-Armenians who do this kind of work, because I tell you, the international legal community that is involved in human rights and international law does not care about the ethnicity of the victim, but they do need the evidence in order for them to make the conclusions, in order for Vahagan to do his research, in order for Karnik to do his analysis, So the evidence shows that what Azerbaijan did and is continuing to do is akin to genocide. And I agree entirely that self-determination or Artsakh in any possible way falling under Azeri rule is the end of Artsakh. I mean, we would literally have to bust them out in order to save lives. There is no alternative. And the right, these are people that have a right to live freely. And what I do want to say is, one of the things I've been going and coming back to Armenia since 1988. I've worked there, I've lived there, I know the people, the entire language. If someone could study language before the 44-day war in Armenia and Artsakh and after the 44-day war, that in itself is a study in genocide, okay? Because before the 44 days war, Armenians raised their kids with the dream of becoming a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, a professor, intellectual, school, education, movie star, whatever it was. Post 44 days, every Armenian who is giving birth to a son is saying, I'm raising the future soldier. That's what this war did to the entire people of Armenia. And that's wrong. That's not, I do not want Artsakh to turn into West Bank. I do not want Armenian to become, the next 50 years, just like the Palestinians who are constantly fighting the battle that is impossible to win. We want our children to grow up to become, athletes and musicians and opera singers. We don't want them to grow up learning how to use a weapon better than their father did. But that's what the 44-day war has done. And that's how it's changed us. It changed us fundamentally, both in Armenia and Artsakh and outside. I mean, even I have now been, I've become weaponized legally because
Right.
Before the 44-day war, I was not doing this. Trust me, I was not on any panels. I was not hunting down evidence. But we have to put all of our tools. I just want to tell you a short little story of how everything we're saying connects. Right before I joined this, I'm in Boston. I'm speaking tomorrow at a couple of universities, but I met with the Armenian community, and someone I don't know gave me a ride back to the hotel so I could tune in. And it turns out that he's a doctor from Baku. He's an Armenian doctor from Baku. And he started telling me his story. And I said, you know what? We need your story. We need your testimony. Okay. It's the same story. The Azerbaijan has been pushing the Armenians from east to west. If you do a map of it, starting from Baku, so this is a continuum. Their policies are clear. They don't hide it. Thank you very much for social media. Just take everything Aliyev says and put it together, and you get the #1 war criminal. If only Karnik will tell me how we're gonna find a way into court about that one. But so I don't know if that answered your question.
It actually did, Akasha. Thank you. It provided actually a lot more nuance than these things are understood. And it also actually dovetails quite consistently with the question I was going to pose Karnik, especially the discussion that, based on the extant evidence and pattern of behavior that we're seeing coming out of Baku and the systemic implementation of their policies, the logical conclusion of their approach is some modality of ethnic cleansing, which brings up the question, right, of the inherent clash between internal and external self-determination. So external self-determination is what Armenians are pushing for, but for the longest time, the international community has been leaning towards internal self-determination, refusing to accept the fact that it could lead to ethnic cleansing. And so our responsibility, as we've been discussing, your responsibility in the legal realm, my responsibility in the political realm is to basically establish or meet the criteria, right, into which we could say, no, the threats to the indigenous population of Artsakh are X, Y, and Z, therefore they qualify the threshold to meeting external self-determination. But here's the issue that we deal with, Karnik, and I really want to talk about this. All the conversations I've had to various ambassadors, international experts who've been involved in this, they told me that all these conversations we're having would work if not for the fact that for the longest time, the Republic of Armenia stood as a security guarantor. So every time we talk about this indigenous population being threatened, and I'm being devil's advocate here, the opposing argument from international observers or those who have been active, their argument has been, but well, no, there's a state that has been actively protecting these people and securing territories. And in that context, Armenians are exaggerating. Okay? So Kostia gave excellent examples of Armenian soldiers being executed and mutilated. But then, the opposing argument is, well, these were not indigenous Artsakh citizens. These were the soldiers of another country, right, fighting in the territory of another country. And so this creates all of these conversations. So external self-determination and the role of Armenia. If removing Armenia out of the equation, okay, in the discourse, or will removing Republic of Armenia out of the equation, will it enhance our argument for external self-determination, Kartik? That is the question that I'm posing. And it's a little controversial, right? But I'm bringing the international perspective into this, and for us to basically be able to counter that discourse.
That is an interesting question, and it's somewhat a loaded one too, because it does play into a lot of the kind of some prevailing themes that are ongoing. Let me say at the outset, removing Armenia from the equation does not enhance our argument, and let me say why. One, in the very human sense. The idea of having a nation state with sovereignty and with access to these international instruments is absolutely essential, right? Without that, you're left with a situation where you have a people without a voice in the international world. Just to kind of take it back for a second, the government of Artsakh doesn't have access to the ICJ. The Republic of Armenia does. The people of Artsakh don't have access to the Human Rights Committee of the UN. Armenia does. So in kind of a broad speak, the role of Armenia is essential to the protection of the rights of the people of Artsakh, regardless of whether or not today it is physically or militarily able to protect. And that's, so I think that the argument that by withdrawing from the process completely, whether we like it or not, Armenia is withdrawn to in terms of a military component at this stage, where the protector of the rights of the physical safety of Armenians is being carried out by Russia right now. But Armenia's complete divorce from the process doesn't help the process at all. I don't think it endangers the process from a theoretical standpoint or from kind of a fundamental kind of legal understanding. Remember, the argument regarding a lot of this. Here's where we lose, and I think that this is where a point should be well taken here. War is not just about drones and about tanks. This particular war is also about narratives, and it's about very strong narratives that have essentially dictated how European powers and Western powers have made their decisions. And I'll bring a couple of examples, and I'll tell you one that's coming. The whole point of territorial integrity versus self-determination is an Azerbaijan-sponsored narrative. You can trace this back at least 15 years when they made this decision. There's an interesting article by Professor Samuelyan from AUA, who wrote in 2010 that if we don't nip this in the bud, we're going to have a war of territorial integrity. And sure enough, I mean, it's sad to say that we're losing this argument, this war. And it's really shocking to me because, in the narrative, in the war of narratives, the evidence is on our side. The story is on our side. We're just horrible at telling that story. I mean, now we're starting to hear little kind of bits and pieces of this. So, so if we look at in terms of kind of what this narrative war is, Armenia has a fundamental role to play in that war of narratives. That doesn't require drones. It doesn't require, it requires studying narratives and establishing, right now, one of the key narratives that Azerbaijan is posing, and it's really important, and when I say right now, I'm talking about a few weeks ago, they started this, that ethnic cleansing that ethnic cleansing by essentially by choice, if people decide to leave, is not ethnic cleansing. Well, that's legally incorrect. Ethnic cleansing doesn't require force. You don't need to be forced to leave at the barrel of a gun. Because they leave you one door and say you can leave, doesn't mean it's now not ethnic cleansing. This is a narrative that is being proposed and pushed by Azerbaijan right now. So that's a state that's pushing that narrative. Armenia has an obligation, as a national security obligation, to push against that narrative. And I say a national security obligation because anybody who's been to Sunik, and I was just down there a few days ago, they're not done. They are not done. We should not fool ourselves to think that by kind of hands off on the Artsakh situation is going to stop Azerbaijan. It is not going to stop Azerbaijan. And one thing I mentioned, Nirsa, if you remember from last week when we spoke, if you look at the maps that Azerbaijan is handing to its own soldiers today, it includes places in Yerevan on that map. Let's not put our head in the sand and think that by kind of taking a hands-off policy, we're going to improve the situation with respect to the right of self-determination. I don't think that's true at all. In fact, I think it closes down avenues, procedural avenues, that only a sovereign state can take advantage of and espouse. But there's also the fact that we're fooling ourselves to think that we're going to be in a situation where that's what they want, and if we kind of push back if we just kind of lay our hands off that and just kind of go on to other things, that we're going to get peace. That's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen based on what they're saying. I'm not saying it even as an observer. There is no reason to hand map to your own soldiers to prepare them for Sunik, for Yerevan, if that's not what they have on the agenda. They're telegraphing that. And what's interesting in terms of the arguments, Armenia is uniquely positioned as a nation state, as a sovereign state, to bring these arguments. And what's very interesting is that the argument and the counter arguments, we should be prepared for these narratives, because Azerbaijan also spoke in the Kosovo case. They have already submitted arguments. They submitted arguments over a decade ago in Kosovo, laying out their argument against Kosovo self-determination, external self-determination. So the analysis of this, the ability to be involved in the process of the narrative that guide nation states to make decisions, is something that is not just in the world of academics or practitioners, but it is in the wheelhouse of a state, of a sovereign state, and Armenia is uniquely positioned to do that. So I think that I push back on the idea that we can, if we remove ourselves from the equation, perhaps we're forced to remove ourselves militarily at this stage. But there are many other fronts that this war is being fought on that we should be winning. We should be winning, and we need to double down on our efforts there, and advocate for these principles, which at their core are not even just Armenian principles. These are humanitarian principles. Why do we not have a Kosovo moment? It's because we are not pushing our narratives strongly enough, and we're not laying out our case coherently enough. There are very few people in the world today that will agree to putting Jews in a Nazi regime. Shockingly, there are some that would. We have to be able to tell our story in that context to make people understand that ethnic cleansing is the result. Ethnic cleansing, whether or not you're pushed out of the barrel of a gun or through an open door that they give you, is still ethnic cleansing, because that's the fight that's coming over the next year. You're going to see more and more of that. The next fight you're going to see is the fact that, well, self-determination doesn't mean the ethnos, but it means the demos. In other words, the people in the general sense of the state, and not the actual ethnic group. These are perhaps more nuanced legal arguments, but they're coming, and they're coming because Azerbaijan has made these arguments before. We've seen it. And I think, just to sum up again, I think the state is uniquely positioned, the Republic of Armenia is uniquely positioned to push these narratives in the appropriate international institutions and mechanisms, not only for the safety and security of Artsakh Armenians and the achievement of their will, but also for Armenia's own national security.
Thank you, Karnik. I think our views are aligned on this, that whole discourse on diplomatization of security. Yeah, the whole point was, the notion, and I'm going to dovetail to Vahagan on this question. So Azerbaijan has hijacked the narrative by basically qualifying the overarching discourse through the lens of territorial integrity. And so their whole argument is, my territories have been invaded. I could do whatever I want to secure my territorial integrity. And so, Vahag, I want you to kind of address this based on your research. If at this point, okay, noting the reality, and as Karnik kind of elaborate on this, in a physical security sense, the Republic of Armenia has very little agency when it comes to the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. What territorial integrity conversations are we having when you're talking about a predatory state, Azerbaijan, and an indigenous population? Okay, what happens with this conversation of territorial integrity where the other country says, I have no claims, Georgia says I have no claims, no country in the region says I have claims in Azerbaijan. So you have an indigenous population and a predatory state. How is the territorial integrity argument sustained in the face of the reality that we're seeing right now?
Well, first of all, I think going back to what Karnik just said, I think, yes, internationally and politically, we are talking about two separate entities, Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. But the moment we actually start to speak about the security and the future and the physical future of Armenians of Artsakh as something separate from the Armenian nation and what Armenia as an international representative on the international arena is capable of, that is actually playing into the hand of what Joseph Stalin actually managed to create a different entity of Armenian population and also physically separating them from Armenia. Because if you actually go in and look at the maps, not only Karabakh was separated politically from Armenia, but at the time being it was adjacent to Armenia. And the Lachin corridor was carved out later on. And we have plenty of maps, among other in our site, mountainouskarabakh.org. We have gathered in our map collection maps that go to the ancient times. I mean, the maps of the ancient times, but at least 3 maps from 1920s Soviet maps, which are clearly showing how Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous oblast was adjacent to Armenia, where it is today, the Lachin corridor. So I would like to emphasize that when we are talking about the rights and security of the Artsakh people, we are not talking about a separate entity, but this should be in the very most interest of the government in Yerevan, but the Armenian nation in general. But maybe even more important, as it has been said here, we are talking about human rights. We are not talking about, as I have pointed out in my book, in my conclusion, that when we are talking about the recognition of the Armenian genocide, we are talking about crimes against humanity. We are not talking about crimes against Armenians or crimes against Christians, but we are talking about crimes against humanity. And as such, that should matter for everyone who counts themselves as part of that humanity. And the UN Charter and the OSCE Charter and everything which enshrines the human rights as the pillars of the democracies that we govern. But going back to the issue of territorial integrity and being an invading nation and occupation and land grabbing and all that, that is not true either, actually. If you look at the conflict from a historical perspective, the whole thing did not start with Armenia invading and declaring this land is ours. It started with a democratic movement inside the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, which should have ended with the voting by the Soviet of Nagorno-Karabakh on February 20, 1988, where they, with a majority of 110 votes against 17, representing the entire population at that time, including the ethnic Azeris, to be transferred from the Azerbaijani SSR to the Armenian SSR. And if we had a functioning democracy, that decision alone should have been enough for reflecting the wish of the population according to the norms of self-determination, which was not only as part of the OSCE Charter, but also part of the Soviet Union constitutional charter as well. But as we know, the Soviet Union wasn't maybe a perfect democracy, and by maybe perfect, I'm underestimating it, of course. And it was denied both by Moscow and by Baku, of course. And only by then, we went into an armed phase of the conflict, and that started as well when the central government of Baku wanted to actually put down the movement by the use of force. And here is something that I have pointed out in my describing these two different principles, at least when it comes to the Helsinki Final Act, that even the principle regarding territorial integrity, which reads, refrain from making each other's territory the object of military occupation in contravention of international law. That this last appendix or the part is actually quite interesting because it is actually opening up for reserving the right for example, humanitarian intervention in case a third party needs to go in order to protect the local population from assaults of the central government. And there you have the notion that looking back to the history of the conflict, it started with a democratic movement. It peaked with a democratic resolution in the Nagorno-Karabakh Soviet, but the central government of Baku ever since then, and it continues until today, tries to put down that movement and extinguish it by the use of force. And that actually goes against every norm in the democratic world, especially when we are talking about the European powers and the United States and the Western democracies, if you may call it like that. So the narrative is, again, not pinpointing territorial integrity against human rights, because if you actually read the UN Charter and think that there is actually an incremental thought behind pointing out the UN Charter, Article 1 mentions human rights and the right for self-determination. Is the article after that, Article 3, that mentions territorial integrity. So if you have an incremental use of putting up what is the very basic rules of governing democracies, self-determination as a human right, basic human right comes first. And that is the one that has been breached ever since 1988, if you would like to go to that date and say that that's when the very first breach of the democratic rights of the population of the Nagorno-Karabakh was breached and has continued until today.
Thank you, Valhagen. Very, very thorough and well-developed response, and consistent, I think, with all of our perspectives here. We're running relatively short on time. There are a set of questions here posed from the audience. Some of them actually do overlap, so I'm going to summarize it, pose the question, and I will give each one of you an opportunity to answer it. So there's a consensus from our audience on the concern of ethnic cleansing or possible genocide should we delve towards internal self-determination. This is very, very straightforward. But most are pretty much the questions here. Most are asking in a nutshell the following. What can we do to create a more of an East Timor Kosovo approach to Artsakh as opposed to the existing one where we have lost the narrative? And second, there was a very good question here that we haven't talked about. What role can Russia play in this? Can Russia be instrumental in this process, or should we mostly look at Russia through the lens of hard power politics and not include them in our discussions of international legal instruments? Let's follow with the order. Kasia, if you can answer that, and then we'll go to Karnik and then Vahagan.
So as far as the narrative is concerned, I think one of the things that will help the narrative become accepted is a few victories in court. For example, the ICJ ruling that it was so far, it's only a provisional ruling. And even the provisional ruling has set precedent with regards to specific issues that the ICJ had never dealt with, including the treatment of POWs as well as cultural heritage. Legal precedent creates narrative. You take legal precedent and you use it politically, and you take this and you multiply it over and over again by creating these legal avenues. One of the things I want to point out is you can create a narrative through PR and by throwing money to PR, which Azerbaijan does a really good job of. However, when you enter the legal realm, a narrative is not accepted unless there's evidence to back it up. Okay, so a narrative is just somebody's version of of how they see, their side. And ultimately, when a court makes a decision, they have to decide on the truth and the facts and the evidence. So once you have some victories in court, you take that and turn it into your political narrative. I'm not someone who is involved in PR. I'm not someone who's necessarily interested in that aspect. Of course, when you're doing legal success stories and you're taking the narrative where the court has made the decision, then you parlay that, internationally, politically, as well as through PR. That's where your victory comes in. Just really briefly on what can Russia be or do, or it can only be a hindrance. Because the one thing Russia is not about is international public opinion or the truth. Russia has been there to crush the truth, and it's done so as an imperialist power over so many, including Armenia. The reason for the last 30 years as an independent sovereignty, Armenia has not participated in the international legal world is because previous Armenian administrations have taken refuge under Russia because it's the safe haven. Russia is the protector. Russia is there for us, right? And am I saying that Russia is the enemy? Yes, because Russia is an enemy of democracy. The one aspect of Armenia today that differentiates us from everyone else, and the reason the world is somewhat paying attention to us, is because we are a democracy. And people react and work out of fear. Our fear that if we turned our backs on Russia, Russia will allow us to be crushed. That is the narrative that Armenia still functions under. Well, yes, we got crushed again with Russia being our savior at the last minute, presumably. And Russia plays this game really, really well. So if you take that, if we take a step, and it's a heroic step, to take a step and say, we're going to make a decision as an independent country and go into an international field like the ICJ. And the next thing I want to plug in right now is the push for the ICC, the International Criminal Court that Armenia is not a member of, and we don't have jurisdiction. I mean, Ukraine is not a member of it, but they've applied and have received jurisdiction. And Armenia still works, and you know, it's a discussion we're having, but you know, it's easier said than done. Armenia still works under the fear of Big Brother Russia. Okay, and you know, anything we do, what's Russia going to say? What's Russia going to do? So far, Russia has not helped us, and you know, historically, Artsakh is the result of Stalin and imperialism. They are not there to save us. They are there to protect their own interests, whether it's in the Caucasus or their oil, getting it out through Azerbaijan, whatever it is. I mean, that's a whole other session, and I don't want to break into that, right? But I don't want to go on. It's been fabulous. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
But I'll let the others speak up.
And this, if I may, can I speak on the Russia point? Because I guess from a particularly,
Please.
yeah,
Please.
specifically with the issue of, and I'm not talking about the geopolitics and kind of the larger concepts of democracy and that. I just want to kind of hone in on this, on the point of self-determination from a purely legal standpoint. You know, if we look at back to what is Artsakh's red line, right? Artsakh's red line, which is pretty clearly stated, is that it's not going to be part of any Azerbaijani state, right? That's the red line, and you know, the question was whether, you know, Russia is helpful. I mean, we can't avoid the fact that the present day physical security of Armenians of Artsakh is being protected by the Russian military. I mean, that's just the reality. But there's something else. There's a little nugget here. I think it's important to kind of harvest from Russia's latest moves, and it's kind of it's probably a very kind of nuanced legal point, but I think it's worth making just to kind of understand that there's kind of different levels to this too. If one listens to Putin's speech announcing the military operation, or the special, whatever he called it, the invasion of Ukraine, there's something really interesting from a self-determination standpoint. You know, regardless of what the political push is, and you know, I'm not defending the political act or the military act. But what's interesting is states very, very, very rarely take action without trying to find legal justification. And what's really interesting here is that if you read Putin's speech, it is about self-determination. It's about the self-determination of Donetsk and Luhansk. It's really interesting, actually, because what we have here at this moment is we have in this newly developing Iron Curtain, that you know, that's going up now or coming down, however you want to look at it, throughout the world. We have now the same legal principle, this idea of self-determination to protect from existential threat, which is what he's laid out. It's really worthwhile to read it. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, or the new Iron Curtain, we have the same legal justification. The justifications he used for Luhansk and Donetsk are the same legal justification Condoleezza Rice used for Kosovo. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable to think about, and what does that mean to me as an international lawyer? Aside from all the political stuff, what's really interesting is that's how a legal principle is developed. That's how a legal justification emerges as a matter of customary international law, and kind of goes back to my theme that these principles are changing and developing as we speak. So whether you're, you know, it's not about a defense of Russia's actions. That's a whole different subject matter. But from a purely legal standpoint, we have two really kind of polar opposites in the world, right? The US and Russia using a legal principle. And that tells you something about the strength of the legal principle itself, that the legal principle is actually developing in a more fundamental way than we really give it credit for. So I think that in terms of, you know, how relevant how relevant Russia is, I think on this very narrow point of the development of the principle of self-determination as external self-determination, its position in this war, legal justification for this war, whether it's justified or not, is secondary, but its argument is relevant. Its argument is relevant because it does solidify further the idea of external self-determination. It may be an unpopular point if you look at it from a geopolitical standpoint, but from a purely legal standpoint, there's an important nugget there.
Thank you, Karnik. And Vahagan?
It has been said so much about this, but I mean, Russia, I wrote an article in 2013 criticizing more or less that the current, or by the then, policy of the European Union was unsustainable regarding South Caucasus. And the article I wrote was just after Sargsyan had come out of a meeting with Putin and announced that Armenia was not going to sign the impending DCFTA, the deeper comprehensive cooperation with Europe that was about to be in the Vilnius summit, and instead would join the then non-existing custom union. And this was due to more or less that the European Union and the United States had this quite strained objectivity, as I call it, towards Azerbaijan and Armenia, not criticizing where it was needed and praising where it was awarded. And the main issue that they always argued was the existing of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. In 2013 said that if we continue this way, Armenia will end up in some kind of a color revolution. Luckily, it was a very colorless, so to speak, revolution and the Velvet Revolution, but also the warning that if we go down this path, it seems that Russia is still trying to create, quote, Soviet 2.0 in order to bring in its lost Soviet republics and satellites into a new kind of hegemony headed by Moscow. And we are more or less in that direction until the Ukraine war. But what we are seeing today now is Judge Abkarian has mentioned Palestine, and if it goes on, and I mean, it could go down that way as well. Or as I and many others have also used, that what we are seeing today is more or less the Cypressification of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, that we will more or less freeze the conflict as it has been for the last 30 years and say that we are going to take care of the question of the delicate question of the status somewhere in the future. But at the same time, and this is what the Sochi document also pointed out, without mentioning the Nagorno-Karabakh anywhere in the document, still speaking of a peacekeeping force on the ground. That peacekeeping force is there of a reason. So what is that reason if not prolonging the Russian presence in the region? Because more or less, if Armenia and Turkey normalize their relations and open up their borders, and the same happens with Azerbaijan one way or another, what need is there for Russia to have a base in Armenia or to have a presence in Nagorno-Karabakh? So Russian role in the South Caucasus and in the Armenian Azerbaijani relations, I think, is quite clear. But that said, the reality on the ground is still that the only thing that's standing between an total ethnic cleansing and the cultural genocide or genocide in its full-fledged meaning are those 2,000 soldiers in Nagorno-Karabakh, unless they are not replaced by another international similar peacekeeping force, which are sent by OSCE or whatever instance that it will be. So Armenia is, and the Armenians are, to put it mildly, stuck between a rock and a hard place. until that situation is not resolved, and at least our Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh don't have concrete guarantees for who is going to safeguard them until the issue of the status is resolved, hopefully. There needs to be someone militarily standing between them and Baku. And at the moment, it is 2,000 Russian soldiers. So that is a reality that we, unfortunately, have to take into the equation and have in mind, going parallel with everything that is going to be done on the legal realm, because we are talking about the so-called high politics and the low politics. And why the high politics, which is the military might, the economics, etc. The low politics, which is about democracy and human rights, it takes a lot longer time a period to implement and create a narrative around. While if you have the military might, if you have the oil and gas money, you can pump it into the media, publish articles in the Financial Times or Wall Street Journal or wherever it is that Azerbaijan is doing, or try to buy politicians in the European Union and lobby in the United States. Low politics going on democracy and human rights, that is something that Armenia and Armenians have failed to capitalize on during at least these last 30 years in a much better way, both implementing it internally in Armenia and using as a case as marketing Armenia as a much stronger, freer from corruption, as an investment market, not only financially, but also politically from Europe. But that is something that it will take time. And that is which we need to work on parallel with the reality of what Russia is playing at the moment until it is replaced with another international entity.
Thank you, Vahagan. I want to thank my panelists. I think the general confluence of geopolitics, international law, and the relationship between hard power and soft power are really playing out in our region. And there's a consistent theme that we're seeing from all intellectuals, especially our legal theorists that are observing developments, is that we have underperformed because we have not used the instruments that we've had to the maximum level. And I think Kasia, Gardner, and Vahagan did a great job of addressing these points. So I want to thank everybody for joining. I want to thank ARPA for putting this panel together. And I wish all of you a good day.
Thank you, Nerses, and thank you, the panelists, for an excellent discussion. I think it was very well organized. We will have another panel discussion on, tentatively, it's on December 10. It will be, the subject is the Armenian diaspora, current issues and future prospects. And the panelists will be Professor Khachik Teololian, Professor Hrac Chilingirian, and Professor Vahe Sahakian. And you're all invited. You will receive the announcement. If we do not have your email addresses, please send us your email address at info@arpainstitute.org. We would love to send you our next announcements. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you, Jakub.